My name is Patricia
Ci siamo. Okay.
And I welcome you to today's talk, where we will discover a rather counterintuitive approach to environmentalism. I'd better get this word. I'll have to pronounce it a lot of times this time. And it's quite also an alternative to fear-mongering mainstream narrative. The talk is promoted by Fondazione Ottimisti Razionale. The Fondazione fights cliché and unfounded fears to prevent people from focusing on the future, and with the support of Italia Più Verde per un ambientalismo positivo, which is an advocacy group aiming to encourage pragmatic green policy. Joining us from California, our guest, Michael Shellenberger. He is the author of a really new best-selling book called Apocalypse Never. It was published last summer and translated in 10 languages, and now it's available also in Italian. And in Italian, the title is Apocalisse può attendere, which is also something sounding like the movie Paradise Can Wait. Apocalisse può attendere, errori e falsi allarmi dell'ecologismo radicale. Marsilio Editore. Participating to the conversation, I welcome Jacopo Giliberto, journalist from Il Sole 24 Ore, Lapo Pistelli, Director of Public Affairs of Eni, and Eni is Italy's #1 energy company, and Chico Testa, Chairman of Assambiente, Waste Management Industry Association. So Michael Shellenberger is it's a 30-year of environmental activism. I think that since high school, he already campaigned and raised money for rainforest, redwood tree, and global warming. He's an expert on climate change, and he testified before Congress. And he also proposed a new Apollo project, which is a sort of Green Deal, new Green Deal ante litteram. It was the Obama administration green agenda. He's advisor of many organizations around the world, and he was named environmental hero by the Time magazine. He's president of Environmental Progress, which is an independent research and policy organization. He's a journalist, and he is author of several books. His previous books were named Breakthrough, From Death of Environmentalism to Politics of Possibility, and Ecomodernism Manifesto in 2015. And last, now, Apocalisse può attendere, errori e falsi allarmi dell'ecologismo radicale. So, apocalypse can wait. Quite a bold statement, I guess, since I remember, 3 years ago, the Member of Parliament, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, was just saying the world is going to end in 12 years. So the end is near syndrome seems widely spread. And it also seems very deep-rooted in environmentalism. Why is it so? Is it a human inclination, or is it something specific from this period, according to you, Michael?
Well, thanks, Patricia. Thank you very much for having me on. I'm really excited to have the conversation with you and looking forward to visiting Italy in September and having these conversations. So my book argues that apocalyptic environmentalism is really fueled by three forces that each need to be appreciated separately, but also together: money, power, and ideology, or what you might call religion. And so sometimes people want to treat them as separately. You know, I always point out that when the conquistadores went to the Americas for the first time, you know, they really believed in God, but they also wanted the gold. And so that same marriage of financial interests, I think political and kind of a desire for power interests, as well as a spiritual crusade that I think we're all familiar with, which is the idea that we fell from a state of harmony with nature as a kind of Eden through the use of technology, fossil fuels, industrialization, and now nuclear, and that we need to reharmonize human societies to the natural environment with renewables and organic farming. And so that's become the dominant spirituality, I guess we would say, ideology. I think it has a supernatural quality to it, which we can talk about, which includes the fear that somehow more people are going to start dying from natural disasters. It includes the fear that somehow more people are going to die of preventable diseases, none of which is in any of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change science or in any good science. Nobody's predicting an increase of deaths from hurricanes, for example, in the United States or in other parts of the world. And so, but there's nonetheless, I think, a really religious quality at the end of the day. Even though I think there's those three factors, I do think that the religiosity is the driving power behind apocalyptic environmentalism.
In fact, one of your chapter is False God for a Lost Soul, is it?
Yeah, and I think it's all pretty familiar to us, and I think sometimes people hear me they might imagine I'm trying to be polemical. I'm not. This is actually grounded in very good sociological research, also very good psychological research that I think is the best psychological research on why people are vegetarian comes out of Italy, and it was Italian psychologists who discovered that behind vegetarianism, the first thing we discover is that vegetarianism is really more of a belief than it is a practice. It's both, but 2/3 of vegetarians eat meat, confess to eating meat. And so it's more of a belief system. It's like a sister ideology to environmentalism. And then I think in terms of environmentalism, I think we all know, it's the new God is nature, and the new priests are scientists who supposedly can tell us how to live. But of course, you have problems right away, which is that scientists are supposed to be describing how the world is, not how the world should be. And nature doesn't work very well as a god, because nature is everything. And if we want to study everything, it doesn't tell us what to do.
So that is because people are so eager to believe in a groundless scenario of a sixth mass extinction, but they can't figure out that they could have, a pandemic, which has by any chance strong scientific basis before, of course, COVID. They were more eager to think it was possible to die from an extinction, mass extinction. This is because of this.
I mean, it's incredible, right? I mean, so a very large survey of people around the world was done in 2019, very large, several thousands of people around the world. And we found 50% of people surveyed thought that climate change would make humans go extinct. Humans, extinction. That's not even, I mean, that's just science fiction. That's not in any scientific scenario. Like I said, there's no scenario in which the number of people dying from hurricanes goes up. To give you a sense of it, in the United States, we had just about 400 people die of natural disasters for all of the year 2019. We have 88,000 people dying from drug overdoses. We have over 50,000 people that die from gunshot wounds, over 50,000 people a year that die from car accidents. So the amount, I think people don't appreciate the amount of the exaggeration. It's not a little bit. We're talking about a just completely different reality.
Mm-hmm. Well, anyway, it's not a climate change denial book, although the title is very harsh, because you say climate change is real, but it's not humanity's biggest problem. So it's quite a defiant statement, because every day we hear about deforestation, warming temperature, plastic pollution, and so on. So how is it possible it's not humanity's biggest problem?
Yeah, and then I think the other question is, how did we ever imagine it was? All else being equal, we should not want to change the temperature at all. So because we have our farming systems, our cities, our natural environments are all around a particular set of temperatures and climate. But obviously not all else is equal. And the fact that we live these really long, prosperous lives with extensive global jet travel and this kind of interaction and communications, all of that rests on a significant use of energy. And so climate change is a byproduct of that. In terms of environmental problems, however, I don't think climate change is really even in the top three. I mean, I think the biggest one is still the conversion of forests into farmland and ranches. That's the biggest. That's, if you believe the mainstream view of coronavirus, that's how we got coronavirus. Mm-hmm. It's the major driver of species extinction, species losses, loss of critical habitat. I would then say the overconsumption of fish is a bigger problem. And then conventional air pollution. I mean, conventional air pollution, if you believe the World Health Organization, it shortens the lives of about 6 million people a year. There's no scenario for climate change to kill 6 million people a year. In fact, the book opens with me interviewing the scientists who have said the most exaggerated things about climate change and confronting them with their own science and finding that they themselves don't suggest anything so apocalyptic. So I think that's why 1/3 of Apocalypse Can Wait is really concerned with this question of what is it in us that wanted to see a real problem, but nonetheless a solvable one, and one that we're making progress on. What in us wanted to see that problem as apocalyptic?
Mm-hmm. maybe because climate change, instead of solving the problem for a whole bunch of people, it's a way of exploiting this problem on a business side point of view. But anyway, according to you, do you want to tell us a little of the biggest fallacy of the environmental alarmism and exaggeration? You already cited some, but in your books there are several from...
Sure. Yeah, sure. And I would just say too, I think that apocalyptic environmentalism, by which I mean the idea that humans are destroying the earth, that there will be many, many deaths in the future from climate change. I don't mean some more pedestrian forms of environmentalism. I mean that kind of environmentalism has to be understood as a mass religion in the same tradition. And I'm not saying they're the same. I'm just saying in the same tradition of other mass political religions, which we would include fascism, Marxism, communism, and I think environmentalism as a different, but nonetheless political religious movement. It is most strongest among atheists and secular people. This is well documented, and I think it's because people are getting some psychological needs from this kind of overarching new religion. There's a business side to it, but I think that the business side is supporting the spiritual quest more than the spiritual quest is being created by the business side. I think it comes deep from within the Western psyche. It's the same thing that Freud and Nietzsche and thinkers have been pondering, which is what happens if people stop believing in God and the afterlife. And I think you end up with apocalyptic environmentalism. So sorry, that was just one final thought on that. So yeah, the book, in terms of the topical issues, I point out that climate change is real, but it's not the end of the world. I point out that efforts to save the Amazon have actually ended up fragmenting the forest by requiring farmers to set aside land when what we should do is concentrate farming. I point out that the Amazon is not the lungs of the world and it does not produce net oxygen. That's just all mythology. I talk about how the plastics that we use in our day-to-day lives are good, overwhelmingly good, and that we have good solutions to them, and that the solutions are landfills, mostly in the United States, and incineration in Europe, that we've basically solved all of the major problems with incineration. They burn at high temperatures and they break up the dioxin molecules. The prior concerns were superseded by the innovations. And that the plastic waste problem in the oceans is to a significant extent a consequence of people in rich countries attempting to recycle materials that should not be recycled, sending them instead to poor countries where we pretend to recycle them. We now know that 90%, it's a shocking number, 90% of our plastics that we put in recycling bins is not recycled. And it's most dangerous when it is sent to poor countries that don't have incineration and landfill capabilities. So plastics, it's even more scandalous. My book helped to inspire some other reporting on this and some other kind of more courageous coverage of it. But basically the picture is that efforts to recycle plastic created the plastic waste problem, including the one in the oceans. And that efforts to recycle, we should recycle, by the way, let me stress, we should recycle glass, tin, and aluminum because they're heavier metals, and paper, but not plastics. Plastics should be recycled or incinerated, otherwise they end up in the oceans. I talk about, well, there's so much more, Patricia, I don't want to keep talking, but there's also chapters on meat, there's chapters on energy, nuclear, renewables. I could go on, but I don't want to. Well,
I see that Jacopo has connected again. Do you want to take the lead?
I have a question. I have a question. Michael, you say that your main message is that mainstream environmentalism could be wrong, mainly. I wonder, but if you were wrong, isn't it risky? Couldn't be dangerous for world or for human beings?
Well, I mean, the first thing is that I was wrong, and so this book, in some ways, is an accounting, my effort to account for how I was wrong in my earlier beliefs. So, for example, I was an advocate of renewable energy. I started to change my mind when I saw the impact of renewables on land. It takes 400 times more land to generate the same amount of electricity from solar or wind as it does from a nuclear power plant. And so we saw conservation impacts in California, and I learned more about the physics of energy. And what I learned in a tradition that starts in Italy with Cesare Marchetti to Jesse Ausable, who was the lead staff writer for the National Academies of Science and Engineering, the first big report on climate change in 1982. Energy density of fuels determines environmental impact. Full stop. It is, this amount of uranium is sufficient for all the energy I will ever need in my entire life, including all the jet travel, everything. And that's a function of energy density. You're releasing a lot of energy from a small amount of matter. So the reason that you have to cover so much land with renewables is because it's a dilute fuel. Similarly, on climate change, it's something that I continue to work on. I never stopped working on it. I still am a climate activist. I am advocating that we continue to operate nuclear plants, and I also advocated the use of natural gas to replace coal. In fact, when it was very unpopular, when fracking was very unpopular, I advocated for it. And now we see that the United States has reduced its carbon emissions more than any other country in the world in human history ever between 2000 and 2020. Why? Almost entirely for natural gas. So I think what's more dangerous is shutting down all of our nuclear power plants, which is what most climate activists would do, and try to power society on technologies that depend essentially on the weather. Solar and wind, they just aren't ever gonna, there's no amount of technological change that will make the sun shine more and the wind blow more regularly. And so solar and wind as technologies are the real risk, the real threat. It means that, and Germany knows this, which is why even as it adds renewables and shuts down its nuclear plants, it's continuing to burn coal. So from a climate risk perspective, you would be like France, 75% nuclear, rather than like Germany, which produces 10 times more carbon emissions per unit of electricity.
Well, one thing that struck me in your book was how you describe this natural decarbonization, passing from wood to coal, from coal to oil to gas, always by citing what you already said. You mentioned before Cesare Marchetti, the energy intensity. So, but almost 2 billion of people are still using biofuels to heat and cook. So, and they are not going to be having the opportunity maybe to use oil, gas, or nuclear. How do you feel about this?
This is, I think, I'm sorry I didn't mention it. I think this is the biggest environmental problem in the world. It's the same problem as converting forests into ranch and farmland. And that's the dependence of, as you said, 1 to 2 billion of our brothers and sister fellow humans in the poorest places of the world who still must use wood and dung and biomass as their primary source of energy. And what I point out, and it really is the theme that runs through the book, is that what is important, and what poor women in Africa want for themselves is also what's good for the natural environment. What we don't want from a human and environmental point of view are small farmers using biomass competing with endangered gorillas, endangered species. What if you talk to poor farmers in Africa and you say, would you like to live in the city and work in a factory or work in the city? It's like 9 out of 10 people say, yes, of course. There's this idea among romantic people in rich countries that poor farmers want to remain poor farmers. They don't. They want to go to the city and use modern energy. And that's great news, because that's also what the endangered species that I describe in the book, the gorillas, the penguins, so many species, they need for humans to give them more room, and that occurs by people going to the city, using electricity, and developing. And so that process continues. Ethiopia, as I point out, is now getting factories. Ethiopia had a bloody, terrible war. It's sad. It's kind of what happens around the world, is that you have these civil wars, that then you have more stability, and then they have manufacturing, and they develop. And I think that process continues. It's been more difficult in some ways for poor countries, but I do think it's the same process.
You are relating about an Indian village protest. It was so funny, this anecdote. They were shouting they wanted real energy and not solar energy. And because you are skeptical that renewable technology can power the global South economies, I'd say it's your point, is it?
Definitely. I definitely want to say, and this is a big theme of the book, whether it's in India or in the Congo or in Nicaragua, I want to say that really everybody wants prosperity. And that means they need energy, and that those of us in the rich world should stop imposing a romantic ideology on people who want to escape poverty. And so in India, the story, it's incredible story. Greenpeace had arranged for solar panels and batteries and a microgrid, but it still doesn't work as good as grid electricity. How could it? I mean, we are so accustomed to having the electricity work all the time. Like, that's what civilization is now. And so the idea that Greenpeace would be conducting what is effectively an experiment on the poorest people of the world to sort of say, here, we're not going to give you what everybody else got. You get to have a lower quality, unreliable form of energy, because what people don't realize is that batteries run out, and batteries are very expensive. I mean, people think, my wife and I, we described going to Uganda and seeing the gorillas, and we're in an eco lodge. And after like 4 hours of clouds, the batteries stop working and they fire up the diesel generators, of course. And yet then we say, oh, we're going to power the whole world on batteries and solar panels. It's ridiculous. I just published a piece today that describes how ridiculous that is.
So
anyway, I'm not sure if I answered it.
You had to offset this. You had to offset this period of gasoline generator during your eco lodge. I'm imagining.
Yeah. The eco lodges are all diesel powered, of course. It's not powered by batteries.
Of course, to our standard, of course, of living, we couldn't stick on the batteries. But still on energy, I've seen that you have changed your mind. You are writing this in your book, and you have changed your mind on nuclear energy. First, you weren't a supporter of nuclear energy. And you also acknowledge that you receive support on this issue from really unexpected people. Among the other, you are mentioning Zion Lights, spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion. And how is it possible to see this sort of support from people who are so far away from nuclear energy and all this being around?
Yeah, I mean, I think another way to ask that question is, why isn't there more support given? I mean, if you compare France and Germany, I think that France and Germany tell you everything that you need to know. You know, France pays a little bit more than half as much for electricity that produces 10% of the carbon emissions as German electricity. I mean, it's just the difference between nuclear and trying to use renewables for me. So the question for me was also, yes, I am very inspired. There are more and more people on the left, we call them progressives in the United States, who understand we need nuclear. And I have to say, I think that probably 75% of the reason is generational. They didn't grow up, millennials did not grow up fearing the bomb in the way that we did. I mean, when I was 12 years old, one of the main TV channels in the United States did a made-for-TV movie for children that showed children in classrooms being killed by nuclear weapons. Like, that was my childhood. Just to give it, people were always like, why are you such, it's like, I was anti-nuclear too. I mean, it was terrifying, the 80s, but that's nothing compared to the 50s. I mean, the 50s and 60s was even more like, So it's understandable that this is mostly generational, and then you get people in their 30s. Now, the misinformation about nuclear continues, but I do think that beyond the misinformation, there's just the reality of this technology, which is so radical and so revolutionary. I mean, you know, nuclear changed everything. It changed international relations. It meant that you either had to be under a shield or have your own weapons. You know, it means North Korea will never be invaded. It's the source of all of the drama between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Israel. And I mean, it's about something much bigger than power plants. And so once you understand that, for me, and once you understand, and this is something that I don't think people appreciate still, you can't get rid of this, even if you wanted to. I mean, Chico Test and I were talking about our Barry Commoner. They really believed that there would be some way to not have this technology. But the problem always was that the technology emerges directly out of science. It emerges at the laboratory level. So literally, if you are a religious person, the gods gave us this extraordinary power, and with it, a huge responsibility. And so I see ultimately all of the anti-nuclear, all of the pro-renewables as a kind of flight from responsibility for this extraordinary and very dangerous power, not dangerous as power plants, but dangerous as weapons. And so you can't understand the fears of nuclear energy without appreciating, I think, the depth of those fears.
You talked before about misinformation, but is there also little information or not much open information from the industries itself, nuclear industry, I mean?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the drama, you know, is that, you know, nuclear is taboo. It has a kind of shameful, it's perceived as shameful. Somebody did something wrong for us to have this power. That's the story. It's an old story. It's the story of Prometheus. It's the story of Daedalus and Icarus. It's the story of the fall. But it's so powerful. It's so shameful, this technology. And so And then during the 60s, of course, there were these crazy, absolutely bonkers claims made about the technology, made about radiation. People were really scared. They remain very scared. Europeans, in my experience, are very scared, more scared than Americans, I think, and maybe for good reason. And that that has impacted the industry. The industry, I mean, the nuclear industry, it's just utilities. It's just electric utilities that own the power plants. So they're often engineers. These are people that are very, very good with machines. They're very good with chemistry and physics. They're not super good at explaining this problem. And this problem nuclear is so demanding. It is such a challenge to us, and it's such a spiritual challenge. I think it's fundamentally a spiritual challenge. I don't think that's not the challenge that engineers signed up for, and so they weren't very well prepared to defend the technology when it came under attack.
But now there are also several, let's call them startup, not really, in the nuclear fusion technology. I just read that lately Thai Technology, which is one of the best financed private nuclear fusion endeavor in the world, has received 800 million. And according to you, how far or how near are we from nuclear fusion technology?
I think we're very far. I think about energy transitions. We mentioned Cesar Marchetti. Jesse Ausable is his American student, colleague. And there's a whole school of energy transitions. They're very slow. You know, we had the first steam engine, the Newcomen steam engine, 60 years before we had the Watt steam engine. I think we're going to have hydrogen jet planes one day where you can fly. They're already talking about it for the president, where you can fly from New York to Australia in an hour. You go into space, right, with hydrogen. Not anytime soon, like, I don't know, 100 years, let's say. We have nuclear reactors that can use the existing waste as fuel. Are they as cheap as the nuclear today? No, not at all. And it won't be for, say, 50 years. Fusion, for me, is even farther. I think we'll have fusion. I'm a big believer. I think we will have fusion. I think we will use fusion for space travel, you know, unless there's some other way to do space travel, which there may be. But if I assume fusion would be something that would come after fission, because that is very consistent with these energy transitions towards higher power density energy sources.
I have a question, Patrizia.
Yeah, I was just asking. Yes.
Oh, a consideration about nuclear power. I think that the fear, mainly in Europe, comes from nuclear has a deep relation with the power of divinity, of God, and so people could be afraid of a sin, like a sin. Nuclear has a relation with the nature, modifying the nature. I think it could be something like this.
Like the tree of the knowledge, from where we got the apple.
The question, Michael, is about your book. You criticize models, climatic models, mathematical.
No, I don't.
In opposition with experimentation and experimental measures. Some idea? No, there is a fashion, like a fashion in this period, tendency of an exaltation of models, isn't it?
Well, I mean, in trying to think if there's any. I mean, I actually rely on the models, and I actually mostly agree with the climate models, in the sense that I think that we can. I agree that, you know, the models are predicting temperature change, so I agree with them that way. But I do have a critique. I agree with, for example, William Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize for economics for his climate cost benefit models. I also cite him. I think he's basically right, but you're right in the sense that I do have a criticism of models, which is that I think that they create false precision while hiding critical assumptions. And what I wanted to do in Apocalypse Never, I had two things I wanted to do. I wanted to write a book that would be accessible, that young people could read and see for themselves the science that I'm using, which is mainstream science. But the second thing I wanted to do was just for everybody to understand a picture that I think is superior to the models. And it's a picture of energy transitions from wood to coal and hydroelectric dams, to petroleum, to natural gas, to uranium, to maybe hydrogen, you know, one day. And that's the right picture. And the other part of that picture is going from being farmers to workers in cities to post-industrial societies, where then the poorer countries adopt that. So for me, yes, in the sense that I think models are abused. And so Apocalypse Never is more, in the way that I wrote it, I wanted to get people to pay attention to first principles of physics before we went into, because the first principles of physics determine the economics and they determine the environment before we went into then the more abstract models that are popular.
Jacopo, no? Well, I have a question. In this book, it's also a book on, let's call it environmental colonialism. Well, anyways, there is a trade-off between environmental target and progress, especially in Global South. How do you see this trade-off? I remember in your eco-modernism manifesto, you were talking about decoupling. Would you explain it a little better for us, please?
Yeah, well, let me say one more thing about colonialism, which is I have a particular beef, I'm using a pun there, with celebrities who, they love Tuscany, Provence, and Napa in California, in my neighborhood.
Yeah.
These are former forests that have been turned into ranch lands, and they love going there. But then they fly their planes over the Amazon and they look down on the poorest people in the world who are cattle ranching and farming, and they go, oh, they're destroying Eden. Give me a break. By the way, we now know that the Amazon was heavily developed before the Europeans came, and European diseases resulted in the genocide that resulted in the rainforests. So let me that's my quick rant on on why it drives me absolutely bonkers, the colonialism. It's ahistorical and offensive. But the idea of decoupling is very simple, and it is consistent with the energy transitions, which is that the United States reduced its emissions more than any other country in the world since 2000 to 2020, not through degrowth, which is very popular in many parts of Europe and the United States, not through anti-economic growth, but through economic growth. We had tremendous economic growth over the last 20 years, and our pollution went down. So that's what is meant by decoupling. The only reason we use that word decoupling, which is not a word I'm crazy about, because I think it's unnecessary jargon, so I don't use it. But the only reason that we use it is because people assume that economic growth goes hand in hand with environmental degradation, and that was never true. Like, that was never the case. You know, the whole idea of decoupling, it's one of those words where it's like, if you really think about what it is referring to, it's referring to misinformation. The idea that somehow the Industrial Revolution was bad for the environment, when it was the Industrial Revolution that allowed for nature and forests to return. Like, you can't have forests if your main source of energy is wood fuel. So that's what drives me crazy about it. That's why I don't use the term decoupling. I just like to talk about
and plastic save a lot of natural resources.
Absolutely.
But it's easy to understand. I mean, no.
Yes. I have to show you something. I'll show you. I'll show you. These are. I always use this example. These are my tortoise shell glasses. We should be so happy they're made out of fossil fuels, because they used to make them out of sea turtles, as I reveal in the book. So if you love sea turtles, you should like your fossil plastics.
Yes, exactly.
Sure. Yes, I would like to ask Lapo Pistilli a question concerning, we have been talking a lot about misperception in the green policy and so on. And so I wanted to know, in your opinion, which is the biggest misperception in the energy transition now?
Okay, let me start by the end. I enjoyed so much reading the book from Michael. So my tips for shopping is buy the book and read it. Because it's well written, well documented. I understand that what I'm saying now doesn't sound sexy, but you find a book in which you have 58 pages in the Italian edition of bibliographical notes, references, and sources. So every single statement is documented, and this is perfect. Because, as you said, Patricia, I mean, the book is important on the one hand for the merit of the wide range of issues that it's dealing with, and on the other hand, because of the way to help all of us to shape a well-informed debate. This is the big thing. When I was a teenager, I remember that we had two opposite, I mean, early 70s. On the one hand, the Meadows reports, the Club of Rome about the limit of development. And on the other hand, there was the reply about the inexhaustibility of resources and the substitutability of technologies. That were the two magic bullets. We don't have in Italy denialists. I will be frank with you. So there's no, the debate in Italy is not the same that in the US. Denialism is game over here in Italy. But I do see the following dangers. The first one is transition to a different energy model is a very complicated and technologically based industrial process. And the big fake news is that you can transform the debate about energy transition into the fairy tale of Cinderella and the pumpkin. So you go sleeping black and you wake up green. It's not about that. You need to take into account all the available technologies. There's no silver bullet. There will be, the transition will happen with different outcome, with different pace in different part of the world. And so this is most important. Secondly, I maybe this is more relevant in the European and more relevant at all in the Italian debate. Transition is not a free lunch. And people would like to have it, but applying also to the energy transition, the NIMBY syndrome. So yes, I want green energy, but I do not want wind farms, photovoltaic farms, chemical plants, waste to fuel. I want green energy, but I do prefer to import energy coming from abroad. And in our case, every single gram or kilo or whatever natural gas, take for example, imported from Russia, is more costly, more polluting, and is not producing development. The third issue that I see, and I think this is, I mean, this is real. Kiko wrote a book that I like very much. I don't know, Kiko, if it's translated in English, but I will translate it. I mean, I'm improvising. It's a praise of happy growth. The title is Praise for a Happy Growth. So we need to combine energy transition, development, and environment. There are no three different pillars. They are on the same equation. And I think we can do it. But what we need to do is to come out from, I would say, loopholes and shortcuts that we have in the debate. The two that I hate the most, and I'll finish by saying that, Patrizia. The first one, I usually put myself on the alert when I listen people talking in third-person plural, conspiracy. They are not telling the truth. They are denying something. They are hiding something. There's no conspiracy in energy transition. You need a common effort to get to a final destination, and you need to involve companies, citizens, because at the end of the day, you have the energy supplier on the one hand with different variety of technologies, and you have consumers. And a big part of the equation is based on our personal behavior. And the second thing that I hate the most, because I happened to me to travel extensively in Africa, Middle East, in some of the countries you mentioned in your book, is rich countries lecturing poor countries. I hate the most because you want to preserve your development lifestyle, and you say, look, guys, you mentioned some of very funny, tragic anecdotes like the socket ball, the recharging ball. If you play 3 hours football with this ball, you can have energy for 30 minutes. So I usually make the example of the women in Africa who are spending, as an average, according to the IEA data, 6 hours a day collecting biomasses and woods. And then we're talking about the exploitment of women empowerment. I mean, that's horrible. This is a slap in the face. You know what I mean? So I love that book. And let me add one final comment, if I may. What is interesting, the book is interesting on the merit and on the methodology. Usually, in every single chapter, you cover a wide variety of issues. Usually, the methodology is you report the conventional wisdom, then you put your personal reputation and story on the line, and then sometimes you argue, sometimes you disprove the mantra. And this is interesting because it's a very rational way to deal with the debate. I think for people like me who are fond of energy, but who are as a profession dealing with public affairs, so how you shape a debate with policymakers, stakeholders, NGOs, the way you describe the climate challenge and the many other topics that you're covering with the book is really interesting. So something that everybody could read and should read.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that very much. I try to, I think it's important to take the people that I disagree with very seriously. And so I take it as a matter of pride that, and I have another book coming out this September that almost killed me. But nonetheless, every single, I take as a point of pride to try to represent my opponent's arguments better than they are able to, than they represent themselves, because they might be right, and I have to take that seriously.
Yeah, but you're right. You know, I do consider climate change and the Green Deal in Europe as a very serious stuff. So what do we think? What do we need in order to get the final destination, to get the job done? Is not to lose our way home in false myth and mantra, which are not science-based. You already mentioned some of the very big arguments, like the land consumption in renewables, and in Europe, we are living in a very dense continent. So there's no a lot of space available to do that. You put in a good order the history of energy, which has always been a history of innovation, from wood to coal to the oil. Now we will talk about the next stage. There are many false myths also about hydrogen and the next energy sources. But I mean, it's good that we involve in a conversation, and some, I would say, fake news that could be dangerous. I mean, the leapfrogging myth is one of the false myth that we have to to disprove, because it's not helping people. It's not helping people. And at the end of the day, let me tell you, I mean, I really appreciated what you did and what you have written in the book about sea turtles and plastic and so on. I mean, I'm not defending oil. I mean, the Stone Age didn't end for the lack of stones, as Sheikh Zamani was used to say, and the oil age will not end for the lack of oil. People tend to think that the oil is the base for production of power, and they tend to forget that if you look around in your dining room, in your kitchen, while you're driving your car, your electric car, many of the things you are surrounded by are made by hydrocarbons. Simple as that. So the oil is the base for petrochemical industry, and you are not only saving sea turtles with your plastic glasses, but even the plastic components of the electric car, which have to replace the metallic components in order to make the car lighter and more effective, are made by hydrocarbons. So we don't have to deny something or to fall in love ideologically with something else. We need to take into account all technologies available, sources available, and to do our job. That's it.
Well,
I hear. I think. I also appreciate what you're saying about. I just don't know how dependent Europe wants to be on Russia. I just think we've seen consequences of scary, of just becoming overly dependent on Russian gas. And when I go to Europe, I always hear people say, "Oh, well, the Russians need our money." I get that, but energy is life. And so you don't mess around with the basis of your civilization.
Yeah, in Europe, that's around 40%, and some of the countries, especially in eastern northern countries, are dependent by more than 90%. But we stopped producing gas in Europe. We are relying on 24% of our consumption is domestically produced. Then we are importing from the North Sea system, from Russia, and from the Med Sea. And this is, let's say, saving the energy security because we don't rely on a single supplier.
Yeah.
Then there's been the LNG revolution. So you can buy spot cargo depending on the cheapest price that you can find. But I mean, if I had to define Europe, it is an empty box in terms of energy. So we talk about the energy of the others, but we're buying energy from others.
Right. Well, and we didn't even talk about it, but I mean, you know, we went through how many decades of people saying never again about the Holocaust, and now we know that all of our solar panels are made in concentration camps. Like over 90% are made in concentration camps in China. So what are we going to do? Just continue to import solar panels made by Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps? I can't believe that we haven't actually halted the import of those, but either way, when I testified before the Senate about a month ago, one of the senators, a former astronaut, Scott Kelly, said, yeah, we have a big solar panel supply chain problem. So like this idea, I mean, it was never made any sense that you would depend on imported Chinese solar, but now I don't see how European or United States or any other countries can import that solar and maintain a good conscience.
Yeah.
Well, it's generally out of sight, out of mind, of course, for us, because they're far away. We don't see them. We don't consider them, but we feel good. I have a last question because time is really running. We could stay on talking for more hours. But,
me too. I have a question, Patricia.
Yes. We need to
please, Pico, go on.
No, I have only a question. Thank you, Mike. Me too. I loved a lot your book. Me and Patrizia, we wrote a couple of books together. One was a pro-nuclear book, and the other one, the title was Against Nature. Why nature is not good, right, and beautiful. This is a human judgment. I mean, you know, I have a joke for you. I have a nice house in Tuscany, and from the terrace of the house, there is a wonderful panorama. No? Friends come into my house, they say, how beautiful is nature. And I say, this is not nature, this is panorama, it's another story. No? Of course, the second thing my friends coming in the nature of Tuscany ask is, do you have the Wi-Fi connection? Yes, of course, I have the Wi-Fi connection, so you can stay in nature. But let's go to the question.
I'm going to steal that one. I like that one. That's the only way that we in California will be in nature is if you have Wi-Fi, absolutely. And
yes,
cell phone
exactly.
service. And cell phone service, yeah.
No, but the question is, we talk a lot about nuclear and US. That's the point, because now Biden is in charge. He wants to change everything in the approach of the United States to the climate and so on. Which do you think will be the big changes that will be? I mean, the Biden administration will be only a, let's say, a politically correct administration talking about renewables and things like that, or they want to keep a real technological leadership, for example, and to do big changes which can achieve the goal of the decoupling and so on. I read your Twitter, and I see you are quite critical about what is happening in the United States at the moment.
Yeah, thank you, Kiko. I think that renewables are entering into a state of crisis in places with high levels of renewables penetration. Germany, California, and Texas. Germany has had to maintain its coal plants on backup reserve. Germany's electricity prices are now the most expensive in Europe, even more expensive than Danish electricity prices. Transmission expansion has largely ground to a halt. They did not achieve the reforms they had hoped to achieve to maintain new wind turbines. In terms of what the federal government in the United States can do, it's actually not as much as it might seem. You can subsidize transmission lines, but you can't eliminate the political opposition to the transmission lines. And so we are a federalist Republican democracy, and so it's difficult for the federal government to just force places to have transmission lines. One of which would bisect the entire state of Nebraska. 90% of the state of Nebraska would have a single transmission line go through it in the middle of critical habitat for whooping cranes, which is one of our most iconic, famous bird species. It's the crane, you know, that Audubon made famous. So, I mean, that is not, you know, courts get involved, there's lawsuits. You know, so there's the transmission problem, there's the solar panel supply problem. Again, I just don't think, at the end of the day, I don't think people can import Chinese solar panels anymore. I mean, I'm sure, I mean, I can go buy them at the store right now, but like, am I going to be able to buy them 6 months from now? I mean, on the one hand, it's far away, but on the other hand, the State Department has declared under both Trump and Biden that China is committing genocide, and the word genocide still has meaning. So you've got a solar problem, and then we have seen now we've got big reliability problems in California and Texas. Are they going to be able to deal with the reliability? Yeah, probably by burning a lot of natural gas, but it won't be solved by batteries or transmission. So you kind of couple that. I kind of look at that, and, you know, I was involved. I've been in this so long now. I mean, I was involved in 2009 in the debate about cap and trade legislation, which was proposed by Obama. It didn't pass. And everybody thought there would be this gigantic global market of carbon credits and carbon trading, and that never happened. And the places that tried to do it, there was corruption and fraud and abuse, and they never had much impact, the carbon pricing on technology. And meanwhile, we're in a gas revolution, LNG revolution in Canada, fracking revolution in the United States, offshore gas revolution globally. That's the main event when it comes to energy. The problem with the Biden plan is that it basically would accelerate the closure of nuclear plants and their replacement by gas. So you could very well see, and this is my next article, you could see the Democrats and Biden's climate plan increasing carbon emissions because it forces the closure of nuclear plants.
But what about the small nuclear plants and the investments in? I mean, Bill Gates invested in there's a new technology, small plants, more safe and so on. This is not because I saw in the documents of the Democratic Party there was the idea of promoting a new generation of nuclear plants. Is still on the field or is out?
I mean, let me answer your question by saying something about history. If you go back and look at the original nuclear designs, even before 45, they were these new designs. So the design that we have now, which is mostly water-cooled reactors, was invented by the Navy. But the Department of Energy had invented the sodium-cooled fast reactor, which is what Bill Gates is now moved to. Bill Gates has effectively recreated a reactor that the Department of Energy, had already invented, and that the Russians have a better version of. And it doesn't matter because these technologies are fine, but the issue is that we have this entire infrastructure, most importantly, a workforce oriented towards a water-cooled reactors, which I think are fine. I don't think that the new reactors get us much different. And as you know, Kiko, if you go from a bigger plant to a smaller plant, you're going to produce less electricity, but you're not going to be able to shrink the workforce. And so the cost of electricity of smaller plants is necessarily higher. So for me, there's a lot of enthusiasts, nuclear enthusiasts, who are very well-meaning, like Bill Gates, but they're not going to, it would be sort of like saying, I'm going to reinvent the jet engine. We have the same jet engine that we had in 1945. It's better, it's more efficient, it's got the combined cycle, but it's the same jet engine. We don't have hydrogen engines. And so for me, as a student of history and energy transitions, I kind of say, look, it's going to take a while to get to these really different designs, including fusion. And we should really work with the technologies that we have in the same way that we do with jet turbines for airplanes.
Okay, thank you.
If I may suggest a line for your next journey, you spent some pages in talking the incredible story of Virunga Park, the gorillas, and the mantra about the oil search and the real scramble for wood and coal. You know that one of the basic drivers of the batteries revolution is about the quest for critical minerals. And so lithium and cobalt and Congo is one of the battleground where you have 60% of the production and the reserves globally. Maybe we hope to find somewhere, and where you have 7 out of the 9 mines owned by China. So because there's a big attention about the condition of workers in many different domains, but there's an embarrassing silence about where the whole world of ICT and telecommunication finds critical materials and critical minerals to provide batteries and for telecommunication, for mobile phones and so on. I think this is a good story to explore.
Yeah, I'm ambivalent about it because, on the one hand, the illegal taking of minerals, often with the complicity of the Rwandan government and foreign mine operators, has driven the conflict. On the other hand, when we did conflict minerals in the United States, I think it was Senator Dodd, and we prevented some amount of the minerals, then it created all sorts of unemployment and social problems in Congo. So I'm very ambivalent, as we all should be, which is sort of like, it's like you look back and they always go, look at that's terrible, the child labor, you know, in the factories. And it's like, well, yeah, because before that, those kids were all working on the farm, and life was actually harder in a lot of ways. So I'm ambivalent about it. If I did something on it, it would probably not have a clean. It wouldn't have a clean message in some ways. I think it would have that. It would recognize the double-sided nature of that.
I understand.
Okay.
Probably consideration. Probably the technology revolution will be possible when a high energy density technology could be miniaturization for a common use, everyday use. I think now nuclear is too young, too big, too large plants. It's very difficult to adopt for a common day use.
When it will be sure that Kiko will bury a nuclear battery in his garden in Tuscany.
Me too. Yeah. People say that to me all the time. They always go, would you want nuclear waste in your backyard? I'm like, yeah. Like, I'm assuming I get paid for it, and it's completely fine. You can put it in my basement.
Yes.
You know, but one of the discoveries I made is that in the Netherlands, they store the waste. Where they store the waste in a single building, it's temperature controlled. So they also store some of their finest tapestries. And so they have these pictures of people drinking wine and eating cheese at a gallery. And by the nuclear waste is like right behind them. I love that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, while I encourage everybody to read Apocalisse può aspettare, errori e false allarmi dell'ecologismo radicale, Marsilio Editori, which is or was a bestseller in US, several weeks, top ranking on Amazon. And I wanted just to ask Michael, is this book brought you more opponent or supporter?
Both, of course, both. It's always the bad always comes with the good, you know, in life. Like, so yeah, it's always both. Controversy is bad and good.
Okay, then thank you very much, Michael Shellenberger.
I look forward to meeting you all. Yeah, I look forward to visiting.
Michael, waiting for you in Italy.
Perfect.
And aiming for you as a guest in my Tuscany house so you can see the
love
panorama.
That's
okay.
Right.
I would love that.
Have to invite all of us.
Take a few days. Cosa dici, Lapo?
Thank you.
You have to invite all of us. Otherwise, this is, out of the rule of the game. You are inviting
Yes, he's making
Lapo comes from Florence. So it's Tuscany is at the center of the story. Okay, ciao, ciao.
Thank you, everybody.
Ciao,
Bye-bye.
thank you. Bye.
Ciao,
Bye.
Ciao.